A movie, Patriots Day, just came out. Some of you, since seeing this, have went and seen that movie. I did not know that movie was coming out when I met our guest speaker today. We were actually standing in line at a WASPIC event, and I heard him talking behind me, and I explained to him, I said, you know, I'm a trained observer and a detective myself at one time, and you know, that's not a Chelan County accent, because, you know, the Chelan County sheriff, he doesn't sound like that when he talks. He goes, yeah, really? So I talked to him for a few minutes and found out that, obviously, and you'll probably pick up on this yourself in a few minutes, that he is from Boston. It sounds like born and raised, from the city of Boston. And we were talking about investigations, and Chief Merner was a superintendent of detectives in Boston. He's finished a 29-and-a-half-year career there. As we talked about this, he was one of the lead investigators on the Boston terrorist bombings. And I thought that was an intriguing thing. So while I'm standing in line there, I took the opportunity to say, would you come down to Mason County, you've probably never been there before, out in the middle of nowhere, and talk to us about that. Bob is going to talk about the lessons learned and some other things in his involvement in that. Throughout that conversation, later I learned that this movie was coming out, and so I said, yeah, I hear in this part of this movie. And he says, yeah, he says, can you believe that guy? Do you think I got somebody a little better looking, a little better built to play my part there, you know, Mark Wahlberg? So anyway, he is actually a friend of Mark Wahlberg's, and he came out here, and he can explain the rest of it. He is now the chief of detectives for the Seattle Police Department. And this is quite a opportunity for us to hear from somebody who's actually led an investigation during a time of actual terrorist attacks in our country. So it really, and the last thing, I kept calling Chief on the phone. He goes, hey, you guys on the West Coast got to get used to something here. He says, my friends on the street, they call me Bobby. He says, just call me Bobby. You don't use that Chief stuff. So with that, great honor today, and I think just a great opportunity for all of us to hear from somebody that's had a tremendous amount of experience, but it's something that hopefully none of the rest of us experience, but can learn something from the Seattle Police Department all the way from Boston, Massachusetts, to the Seattle Police Department, to Shelton, Washington. I want to introduce Bobby.
He left out what kind of a line we were standing in. We were in the beer line when we met. So for all those folks that go to these conferences and they talk about networking, that's where it really happens afterwards, in the beer line. I just want to take 1 second. I'll introduce myself, but to talk about networks and folks working together. See Ned Newland sitting over here, and he and I went to the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia in 2008, and we spent a lot of time in what they called the man camp, which was another beer line. But to tell you how small this business gets, I was just recently I got a chance to sit with the chief from San Bernardino talking about what happened in his town. He actually was an individual that I went to PERF with in Boston, the Police Executive Research Forum, and he said to me, when he was at PERF, he was one of the smaller departments there, and the city of San Bernardino is in receivership, has been in receivership for 12 years. They don't have any major infrastructures, they don't have any major sports teams, they don't have any major financial districts, they don't have anything that you would kind of believe would be the target of a terrorist attack. So I think the lesson is what he talked about. He said it can happen anywhere. Two of our classmates from the FBI Academy, one now Captain Detective Frank O'Neill, he led the investigation into the Charleston church shooting where the 9 people were shot and killed, and another classmate of ours was a captain down there at the time when we were in the Academy, South Carolina State Patrol. Is now one of the sheriffs down there, under-sheriffs down there in South Carolina, and Frank and Jim Woods led the investigation. These are guys that we met in 2008, and then obviously I, not by choice of my own, got involved in the Boston Marathon bombing investigation. So these are the most important meetings, that when these things happen, you know all the faces in the room, And I just thought that was, Ned made me think of that. So, 3 or 4 of the biggest events that have happened, terrorist events that have happened in this country, are people that I've happened to meet at either conferences like this or trainings for police departments. So, I'll give you a brief introduction of myself. I started in this business also in 1980. I worked for the Massachusetts Department of Correction. I started at 18 years old. I worked for 4 years in the prison system, 3 years in maximum security, 1 year in medium, and then another half a year at the hospital correctional facility. And then I went into the Boston Police Department. I did 29 and a half years there, pretty much working every rank, all the way up. I was, my one love was homicides. I did homicides for 17 years as a detective, sergeant detective running a squad, the commander of the homicide unit. I ran the narcotics unit. Ultimately was a deputy superintendent. I ran half of the detective bureau, and then before I retired from there, I was the chief of detective superintendent. And people always say, well, why? Well, like a lot of folks in this room, I happen to hit the magic numbers. The magic numbers were 55 years of age, 32 years of service. I was 56 years of age, 34 years of service. Felt like I still wanted to do this. And when some of the positions came up, I had been offered a couple of smaller chief's jobs. One of the positions here was being the chief of detectives. So that was my comfort zone. I had been doing investigations since 1989, and those opportunities don't come up that often, so I'm here in Seattle. Just quickly, I can tell you, I could take the homicide guys, the narcotics guys, the gang guys, sexual assault detectives, anyone that works for me here in Seattle, put them in Boston, and take the Boston guys and put them in Seattle, and take anyone in this room. I was just listening to the honor for the detective earlier. That's what we do. So you could switch uniforms, switch places, and other than getting used to the Boston accent, you can put these people in any place. Just right before I start, the marathon in Boston is a very, very special day for us. I've worked them for 29 years. Every single police officer in the city that isn't working in a district, which is our precincts, is in uniform. It's a great day for us. Some years back when I was, I ran the public order platoons as a lieutenant, as a deputy, as a superintendent, which I know for some of the agencies in here would be surprised, but 102 officers in the narcotics unit, 75 officers in the gang unit, 50 officers in the bicycle patrol. And everybody's in the black pajamas on marathon day. We do the, Occupy movements. We do any of the sporting events, parades, and such. So you have 225 people that you're not pulling from patrol. It makes a big difference. So some years back, about 4 or 5 years before the bombing, I had everybody in the drug unit, the gang unit pitch in. We bought 4 grills because on marathon day, you can't get in a line to get a cup of coffee or a sandwich for the cops. We always set them up off-site. First, we used to hide them from the bosses when I was a lieutenant. And then as time went on, and you'll see Ed Davis, who was played by, I can't even think, it was Tom Arnold in the movie. He was always one of the first guys at the grill. He's about 6'5", about 320 pounds. So when he became the commissioner, he always said to me, Bob, where are the grills? But it's one of those days where you see cops from all over the city that you don't normally see. Boston has 2,300 police officers. It's guys you haven't seen in a long time. Everybody works. It's a long day. You start at 5:30 in the morning. You don't get out of there till 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. We have the grills going. There's a Red Sox game right in the middle of the day, which is about half a mile from the finish line, which you'll see. And it's just a great day for us. I've had the pleasure, the opportunity of running 5 Boston marathons. No, I don't qualify, but we get the law enforcement exemptions to run. And when if you're not running it, you're working it. That's it. It's a great day for us. And like every place else that's been the victim of one of these attacks, we didn't expect it on that day. I'll just say a couple of things about how I feel about law enforcement. My father-in-law is deceased, was a police officer. I'm a police officer. My brother's a police officer, my nephew's a police officer, my son's a police officer. And so we love police officers. My daughter has now been dating a fireman for 2 years. The first day he got to meet us all was at my son's wedding, so there was naturally the narcotics unit, the homicide unit, the command staff, the police department, and his first day. But without further ado, I'm going to just start our video as to the events that took place on April 15, 2013, and then I'll go into the PowerPoint. What's most important, and you know, it's great. Yeah, Wahlberg played a composite character of myself and one of the sergeants at the finish line. He could have played any one of 1,000 police officers that were there, federal agents, state troopers. Everybody pretty much took it personal that day. In Boston, we really took it personal because it's our marathon. But I've known Mark since he was a kid. When he was on probation, his probation officer was one of my close friends, Richie Skinner. They're Dorchester kids. They grew up one neighborhood over from me. I grew up in Roxbury. And he, you know, some people said too early for the movie, but he wanted to make sure that he did it right. And they did a very good job. Casey put together those flyers for the table, so I'm not taking any abuse for those 4 trophies that you see in those flyers. And hopefully it's 5 next week.
Explosions near the finish line of the Boston Marathon.
Bombs explode at the Boston Marathon. At least 2 are dead, many dozens hurt.
All I knew what to do was pray.
At 2:50 p.m. today, there were simultaneous explosions that occurred along the route of the Boston Marathon near the finish line. These explosions occurred 50 to 100 yards apart. Each scene resulted in multiple casualties. At this point in time, all of the victims have been removed from the scene. We have sent officers to hospitals to be in touch with family members and possible witnesses.
Continues. All of those in law enforcement, represented by the leaders here, will be present in force in the area around the blast and throughout the city.
We want to remind you about those who died yesterday, to remember who they are. 8-year-old Mark Richard of the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. That little boy, his picture and his face will be emblazoned in all of our minds. A very sweet boy. His mother and sister were 2 of the people critically wounded in the attack. And there was 29-year-old Crystal Campbell, a restaurant manager, caring, loving, daddy's little girl. And now there is a 3rd victim, Boston University graduate student, someone from China. We don't know her name, family has requested that it not be released at this point. Those 3 people all lost their lives in the course of what they thought was a regular, perhaps special day in their lives.
This is a bad day for Boston, but I think that if we pull together, we'll get through it. We're strong city, a lot of people willing to work together to make this a better place for all our people. And so, as we gather here today with all our officials, let's say Boston will overcome.
Now, one of the sources is a Boston law enforcement source who tells me that an arrest has been made in the investigation here in Boston.
The suspect that was identified has now been arrested.
And we would assume that. I've just been told that an arrest has been made.
Conflicting reports about a suspect identified in the Boston Marathon bombing. The FBI and the U.S. Attorney both issuing statements late this afternoon saying no one has been arrested in the bombing. Earlier this afternoon, the federal courthouse in Boston was evacuated. A law enforcement official said there had been a bomb threat, and that followed several media reports that a suspect had been arrested in the marathon bombing.
Boston President and First Lady step off Air Force One and walk down the stairs and be placing their feet on the ground here in Boston.
We momentarily knocked off our feet. But we'll pick ourselves up. We'll keep going. We will finish the race. And this time next year, on the 3rd Monday in April, the world will return to this great American city to run harder than ever and to cheer even louder for the 118th Boston Marathon. Bet on it.
Today, we are enlisting the public's help to identify the 2 suspects. After a very detailed analysis of photo, video, and other evidence, we are releasing photos of these 2 suspects. They are identified as Suspect 1 and Suspect 2. They appear to be associated. Somebody out there knows these individuals as friends, neighbors, co-workers, or family members of the suspects. Though it may be difficult, the nation is counting on those with information to come forward and provide it to us. We consider them to be armed and extremely dangerous. No one should approach them. No one should attempt to apprehend them except law enforcement. Let me reiterate that caution. Do not take any action on your own. If you see these men, contact law enforcement.
If you take a look at everybody up on the fence watching the marathon, and you can see them walking behind, so that's kind of when we talk about our suspicious activity reporting.
Of a shooting incident at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
According to the radio traffic or the scanner traffic that we're hearing, spoken by the Boston EMS, there's a police officer who has been shot. His gun was taken from him. The situation is still very volatile.
This is YouTube video of this firefight in Watertown.
We're going to close this big detonated.
Exchange of the gunfire, we believe that one of the suspects was struck and ultimately taken into custody. A second suspect was able to flee from that car, and there's an active search going on at this point in time.
It's been a very tense night, and we've been on the air now for a good, 3 hours?
If anybody approaches a suspect matching the outstanding party, use extreme caution. A trigger was found on the body of the individual currently in our custody. Indications are strong that the current outstanding party may be wearing a suicide vest.
Just chilling information coming in off the Boston police scanner. That would explain why you have those thousands of police out in force and why every single person in the city of Boston right now is going to stay inside.
In light of the status of the investigation here in Watertown and the developments in the course of the day, the stay indoors request is lifted. Continue to be alert to suspicious activity. Remember, there is still a very, very dangerous individual at large.
People hearing gunshots fired there. Jen, can you hear us?
Yes, Lucy. Right after they lifted the bad guys, there was a tremendous amount of police activity.
That is the suspect on the boat tonight before he was taken into custody.
Police captured Tsarnaev. He had lost blood, was weakened, but authorities say he had put up a fight in that backyard, engaging them with gunfire.
The Boston police announced their success with a victory tweet. Captured. The hunt is over. The search is done. The terror is over, and justice has won. Suspect in custody.
4 days ago, my city was ruthlessly attacked. There's no explaining the savagery involved here. There's no explanation for it. I spent the last several days looking at hundreds of hours of videotape. I got to see how brutal that attack was over and over and over again. But more importantly, I got to see what the Boston police officers who responded to that scene, along with the medical personnel and the other first responders, did to put people back together. Tourniquets, stemming the bleeding with their hands, putting a man who was on fire out with their hands. These are the kind of things that came out of this savagery. It makes me proud to be a Boston police officer. It makes me proud to be a part of this team. Rick DeLaurier from the FBI could not be more cooperative. We've sat together almost hour for hour for the last 4 days, sharing every single bit of information in a real team. Colonel Albans, the same way. Carmen Ortiz, with us all the time. And then, to bring the governor and the mayor together, leading the city of Boston in responding to this. I finally just want to say that the citizens of the city have been incredible. They've been patient with us. They've endured an enormous amount of heartache and aggravation over the last 4 days. We're very happy to try to put this back together.
Whatever they thought they could ultimately achieve, they've already failed. They failed because the people of Boston refused to be intimidated. They failed because as Americans, we refuse to be terrorized.
So that kind of sets the stage for it, but you know, a lot of things went well, and in law enforcement, as everyone in this room knows, if somebody comes up with a good idea that starts to work, someone's going to come and take it, which is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to go to all the good ideas, and most of what we learn in law enforcement, unfortunately, and especially in this public safety business, is we learn by our mistakes. So a lot of things went right that week. There was some things that happened that worked to our advantage. There was some things that, you know, just by the luck of the draw, worked to our disadvantage. For instance, I happened to have run the 2012 Boston Marathon. It was a mild winter in Boston, very little snow, great winter to train. And by 10 o'clock that morning, it was already 80 degrees in April. That never happens. By the end of the race, it was 86 degrees. They were giving out all these heat warnings. 7,000 people deferred in 2012. I wasn't smart enough to do that. I ended up in a medical tent with some IVs on at the end of the race. But 7,000 runners who deferred because of the heat were added to the race that year, and they limit the size of the race, so we had 7,000 more. That was one of the bad luck things. The good luck things was they had a medical tent at the finish line, and because so many people, 2,500 people ended up in the medical tent, about 1,100 people ended up in the hospital in 2012, they doubled the size of the medical tents at the finish line. So it used to be one pretty big one at the finish line, one a little ways down, a mile away, and one a little bit farther towards the Boston Common. They doubled the size of the medical tents. They 2.5 times nurses, doctors, firefighters, volunteers in the medical tent. And the weather that day was a beautiful day, so they were basically sitting around all day, extra wheelchairs, extra stretchers, all of those things. So that was one of the things that worked to our advantage. Jimmy, we can just hit that. nobody brought an automatic, so Jim's gonna handle it for me. I'll probably have to come back next month and help him. 2 explosions. So you saw that the race, the winner was at noontime, and you know, the Kenyans, Ethiopians finished these things in about 2 hours. So why, you know, 4 hours or 2.5 hours later, 2 hours and 50 minutes later, you know, do they elect to do the bombs then as opposed to blowing it up at the where the winners are? All of the dignitaries are in that finish line area: governors, mayors, senators, etc. And it's very controlled when the world-class runners are coming in. 2 hours later, 3 hours later, when the regular folks are coming in, the finish line area kind of gets opened up. The crowd is 3 times as thick, and you can see the numbers of runner. When DeSissa comes through, he's one of the only runners on the street, but when the bombs go off, there's dozens and dozens of runners. So they pick their timing for a reason. Hit that? Same thing, second explosion, and they hit the Forum. That was the Forum restaurant on the street there, and the reason, that's where everybody piles up. There's bar stools, bar tables, there's open windows, so it's really packed. It's one of those places where you get a seat there at the Forum and you don't leave it all day. 2 explosions, and you know, all I can say is the response, and you'll see the response from police, fire, and EMS, and the ambulance service in Boston is also part of the city. Boston Fire Department was amazing there. Go. Keep going. This is one of the things that, you know, we were very lucky. We had 3 deceased at the scene, 264 injured. We triaged and cleared the entire scene in 22 minutes. The interior perimeter scene was 12 blocks, 18 blocks was the outer perimeter. What's most important is, of those 264 people that left in ambulances, police car, undercover vans, every piece of equipment that was out there, obviously we all have rules about transporting injured parties in police vehicles and so on. Everything went out the window that day. And there was 41 catastrophic amputations at the scene there that day. Some people lost 2 limbs. So you saw little Martin Richards, who was killed. His little sister lost a leg. His mother lost an eye and still has some permanent brain damage as well. If you notice in the video, you see when the Sun Irons are standing there, there's a auburn-haired girl with sunglasses on. That's Crystal Campbell. But when we went through this piece by piece on the videos and the still photography, Zokar Sinai of White Hat, he puts that briefcase down directly behind the Richards family. He puts it directly behind little Martin Richards. So there was an intent there to not only kill as many people as he could, but kill innocent victims at every chance. The response there, that in the picture there is Billy Evans, and the short, stout guy is me. But Billy is 58 years old. He just ran his 51st marathon. And you can tell from the look of him, he's a marathoner. He was the chief of patrol at the time, and he's now the police commissioner in Boston. He had run the marathon, and he's a 3-hour marathoner. He ran the marathon, was already back at the Boston Athletic Club in the whirlpool when the bombs went off. I was about an eighth of a block away when the bombs went off. In between where the bombs went and where I was, my son was in the middle working his 2nd Boston Marathon. And for all the married guys in the room, his mother called me when the phone service finally went up. I got my phone, I answered my phone, and she said, "Where is my son?" I said, he's fine. I told him to put his head on a swivel, he's about a block away. She said, "Oh, all right." I said, "And I'm fine too." She reminded me I wasn't her blood. When I talk about relationships, so that's Brian Perkins from the ATF in the room there. he and a couple of other ATF guys had an office right in Boston Police Headquarters. So when we were working these scenes with the FBI, the ATF, Homeland Security, they're all people that we had worked with. The bosses knew each other, but what was more important was all the worker bees knew each other. So as we're working those scenes, these relationships, we weren't introducing each other for the first time, and I think that's one of the biggest takeaways here. Is that Jim? Again, I said 12 blocks inside. You can see that roof there where the two techs are on the roof and one coming out the window. That's where we found the lid to the pressure cooker that had the serial numbers on it. We're able to trace it back to where it was bought and start our investigation from there. One of the most important things, you saw the videos, and there was a little back and forth with the FBI about whether we're releasing photos, weren't releasing photos. Sergeant Detective Earl Perkins from our intelligence unit put together a team with some ATF guys, some state police officers, and he started pulling video right away. Within a half hour to 45 minutes of these bombs going off, we had the video with the black hat and white hat in it. The FBI came in later as the lead agency. There was a little pushback at the scene in the beginning because people say, well, this is going to be a federal investigation. I said, well, right now it's a triple homicide in my city with 200 plus people injured, so it's mine until somebody tells me it's not mine. I took the crime scene about 8-10 minutes after the bombs went off. But you got to remember, everybody ran. We had 2 bombs that went off with backpacks or some type of devices. Everybody that ran left a backpack, a pocketbook. There's about 14 hotels in this 12-block area. People left full suitcases and everything. So before we could do anything, photograph, start processing the crime scene, we had to have all of our EOD units, state police EOD units, ATF, FBI, every EOD unit we could get our hands on in the state to come in, and we had to clear all those bags first. So we were hours before we even got going. We pulled the video, and all the evidence went down to the World Trade Center in Boston. We spread out, we built a warehouse scene down there, laying out the exact scene of the finish line. And unfortunately, well, we ended up turning around. The video went on a plane and was heading for Quantico, Virginia. We got the plane turned back around because every sheriff, police officer, trooper in this room understands that we have a robbery at a 7-Eleven right now and we pull video. What do you have to do? You have to watch it. And we want to watch it with people that might recognize individuals that are from the area. And then, you know, we branch out, you go out to your other specialized units and other departments and ultimately to the public. So the video being on a plane heading to Quantico didn't work out. But we got the plane turned back around and we started looking at the video. Anybody that's been part of a presidential visit in an area, especially in a big city, it is like the marathon all over again. It ties up every single cop in the city. Some of the lessons learned was we put every single cop in the city 12 on, 12 off. But by the time we started working this bomb scene, most of the department had already been working for 12 hours. We had to decide who was going home and who was staying. We worked that out. Bill Evans and I worked it out from the patrol and investigative branch. And then right in the middle of it, you know, when we loved the president, it was great that he came. However, he came right in the middle of while we were processing an 18-block crime scene. We had every cop in the city already working, so all the folks that were on their 12 hours off had to come back in for the presidential visit. It creates a nightmare, it creates more of a traffic nightmare. It's just, logistically was a problem. President came, we were continuing on with the crime scene, and there was a give and take back and forth that we wanted these pictures released. Somebody has to know them, especially if you look at white hat, that's Zokar Sanayev, black hat is Tamerlan Sanayev, and the pictures of Zokar were so clear, we figured somebody had to give them up. As you know, the investigation took us down at UMass Dartmouth College. There was kids that smoked weed with them, hung out with them, took class with them. Not one of them ever picked up the phone and said, hey, that's Zokar Sanayev. It didn't happen. We released that picture. press was, no offense to our press people in the room, the press was a nightmare. In the middle of this, as you saw on Tuesday, the day after, they announced, CNN and Fox, rushing to get a story out, said there was an arrest made. So where did everybody go? Hundreds and hundreds of people went to the federal courthouse right in downtown Boston. Created more of a problem for us, trying to cover. So we have the president coming, we have people showing up, everybody wants to get a piece of these people that were arrested. They weren't arrested. Now, I'm not a Twitter guy, I'm not a Facebook guy, I don't do any social media. Having worked in homicide for 17 years, it's probably not a good thing. But our Twitter accounts increased by a couple of 100,000, and Ed Davis and our media people were able to tweet out right away, there has been no arrest, because more and more people are coming, public transportation, cars and everything, heading to the courthouse to get a look at whoever was arrested. The day the president came, we had half the public order platoon down, we covered the president. That was Thursday the 18th. We're going back down to continue, and I just want to talk a little bit. I mentioned, a little back and forth. Running the crime scene, I had the crime scene, I had my lieutenant detective from the crime scene response unit at ASAC that was in charge of criminal investigations in Boston, assistant special agent in charge, John Foley. He had the FBI, and now the #2 guy in the Massachusetts State Police, Frank Hughes. We handle the crime scene. Every night we met with all of our supervisors at about 7 o'clock in our headquarters, where we had the crime scene headquarters, which was at the Lenox Hotel, which was basically on the parade route. We just used a different entrance. Every single night, every agency was briefed on every single thing that we found that day. So you always hear about, well, the federal agencies didn't tell the locals didn't tell the state. There was none of that. Every single agency was briefed on what we were working on that day, what we found, and that was even before we briefed our bosses, so that the folks that were out there working these crime scenes. We ran the crime scene for 6 days. Crime scene was still going when the president came, and then that night, after we cleared the president, we went back, we were setting up, remember, we had to cover 11 police districts as well. And during that time, and it's one of the things that I always talk about in Seattle with protests and the like, where we're spending all of our resources, we had 13 shootings in the city of Boston, because everybody knew that the cops were tied up. So some of the gang members and beefs that were going on, they settled their scores while the whole city was tied up. That night, as we get back to the crime scene, we're doing our briefing, and I get a call from one of my detectives who said, hey, they just shot a MIT cop. I said, what do you mean they? He said, Bobby, this is not a just a regular police shooting. It said in the video, I think the news reported that they stole his gun. They didn't steal his gun. And we've watched the actual video of this. Collier was in his car. He's a campus police officer sitting in his car. The Tsarnaevs had all kinds of pipe bombs. They had set off 2 pressure cooker bombs at the marathon. You'll see that in Watertown they set off another pressure cooker bomb during the shootout. And Collier's sitting in his car. They had 1 gun between them that they bought. He's in jail as well, the guy that they bought the gun from. They wanted Collier's gun. They walked up to the car. As they did, a female jogger started to come by. They walked away from the car. They observing the street, saw a clear shot, and one of them just walked up and shot Collier right in the temple as he's sitting in his car. No warning, no questions, no anything. We thought he maybe, was trying to reach for his gun. His Sam Brown belt was all twisted. They couldn't figure out how to get the gun out of the safety holster, and then they were trying to rip his belt off, and they couldn't figure out how to get his Sam Brown off. They actually left, Sean Collier was killed, he was dead on the spot, and they never even got his firearm. So they flee there in a vehicle that they had. They want to dump their vehicle. They went to a gas station. You can hit that, Jimmy? They went to a gas station and hijacked, there was an Asian male who I got to meet just recently again. They carjacked his car, took him to a gas station. They took the pressure cooker and some of the pipe bombs out of their vehicle, put it in his vehicle, He was here from China. He was a student at MIT. He was in the state of Massachusetts in the United States for 7 days when this happened to him. All of his family was in China. Took him to a gas station, demanded his debit card, his PIN number, and Zokar was in getting milk and snacks and sodas and whatnot to go. They were going to drive to New York and set off another pressure cooker in Times Square was their plan. They made him put a seatbelt on. At some point during the encounter, while Zokar Whitehat is inside the gas station, Tamerlan, for some reason, takes the pistol that he's been holding on the carjacked victim, puts it in the side panel of the door, and either starts calling or texting somebody. The victim saw his opportunity, unlatched his seatbelt, ran out of the gas station, ran down the street, got to a convenience store, on his hands and knees, and we have a lot of this on video when he gets to the convenience store, having the attendant at the convenience store lock the door and call the police. As soon as he called the police, he said, "I have OnStar in my vehicle." They started off, they set the OnStar and the chase began. Chase ends up going into Watertown. And just one of the things for us, well, Watertown Police did a phenomenal job out there, MBTA Police, State Police. 7 of my guys from the narcotics unit and the gang unit were involved in the shootout in Watertown. As I was driving, my nephew was, happened to be in, my nephew's another little fella, he's 6'5", like 330, 340. He was a guy that was ripping the clothes off of Tamerlan Tsarnaev when Zokar ran him over. But listening to this, trying to get to the scene, and again, it was not a whole lot different than me coming from Seattle down to Shelton this morning. As soon as I get into the fog, I was like, 90 years old, trying to figure out where I was going so I didn't get lost. We're in a different community, not a community that we normally work in. We're in Watertown. We're trying to find side streets where the shootout has taken place. Over 200 rounds fired in this shootout. While they were chasing, one of the persons dispatched on the radio happened to be my nephew, and he said, they're throwing effing hand grenades at us. And they were throwing pipe bombs out of the window of the car. When we got to the scene of the shootout, they had exploded 2 more pipe bombs with the officers. There were 3 unexploded IEDs in the street, which you can imagine the number of police officers that converged there. Nobody knew that these pipe bombs were discarded along the way that didn't get activated. And it was pretty dark, pretty crazy, and everybody's trampling right through this scene, rightfully so, trying to get to help. But just something that, one of the lessons that we learned afterwards. They set off a 3rd pressure cooker during this shootout. Unfortunately, and I'm not a bomb guy, they tell me it wasn't sealed well enough, so instead of exploding, it went sideways and impaled itself about 1.5 feet into the side of a car. Tamerlan gets shot in the shootout. That's not what killed him. When his brother was fleeing the scene in the stolen Mercedes, he ran him over and he got caught up in the wheel well. Not that any of this is humorous, but he quickly became speed bump in law enforcement circles. Zokar takes off, dumps the car about a mile away, and obviously we have a major shootout scene that needs to be processed, over 200 rounds. State Police, Boston Police, MBTA Police, and Watertown Police involved in the shootout. So there's a coordination there as to who's going to run the scene, how we're going to do this. We started running it, Boston Lieutenant Greg Long, we assigned from our shop, doubled and tripled it up. And then myself and Bernie O'Rourke and Sergeant from Watertown and a Lieutenant from the State Police went down and set up that parking lot that you saw the next day with hundreds and hundreds of cops. That was about 25 officers in the middle of the night where we set up an original perimeter, and then as the reinforcements came, we reinforced it. Here's some of the key things, and then I'm going to get into some of the lessons that we learned that I think are the most important. Obviously, presidential visit was a nightmare for us right in the middle of this. If we had enough juice and we could have advised them, we would have preferred. I know there's always criticism one way or another whether a president or vice president shows up at one of these things, But if we could have advised, we would have asked them to not come to the memorial service, because for law enforcement, Boston, state, local, it became a nightmare having the president come in the middle of this. We obviously had funerals going on, victims, and then the investigation was round the clock. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We said everybody was working 12 on, 12 off. Most people were working 14, 16 hours. Then we were going back, setting up what was going on in the rest of the city. We had released the photographs, and there was a lot of back and forth on that, and then we had another police officer murdered in the middle of this. The shelter in place, I'll tell you quickly how that came about. That morning while we were doing the search, all taxi cabs in the city of Boston are licensed by the police department, our Hackney Carriage Division, and there's a GPS in all of the cabs. So we were in Watertown, but just over the border to Brighton, and if anybody knows Boston, that's Brighton is where Boston College is, just over the border in Brighton. So at about 5:30 in the morning, we contacted Hackney Carriage, and we said, just for the hell of it, did any Boston cabs pick up down by the Arsenal Mall or somewhere along the Brighton-Watertown border? We had a cab that picked up 3, as was described to us, Arab males, and dropped them off down on Lincoln Street at 5:30 in the morning. Lincoln Street is directly adjacent to South Station, the major Amtrak station and hub of all the buses and trains that come in and out of Boston. Our officers from District 4 stopped that cab. The driver was on the terrorist watch list. I know we have a retired Secret Service agent here, but I found out then that the terrorist watch list can be iffy. Like, my name is Merner, and, you know, my birthday's 1/26/59, by the way, yesterday. But if there was something close to my name with a close birthday, you can end up on the terrorist watch list depending on what country you came from. So this guy was on the terrorist watch list. Our guys stopped the cab. Naturally, you know, we stopped the cab with MP5s and dogs and bomb guys and everything else. He denied that he ever picked up a fare in Watertown. He was more concerned, as it turned out later during the interviews, about his Hackney carriage license, because he's not supposed to pick up outside the city. So he denied that he picked up a fare. It had absolutely nothing to do with this investigation, nor was he, when we finally dug down into it, was he the guy that they were looking at on the terrorist watch list. But it caused a lot of consternation. We thought they were going to blow up the train station. We thought they were going to do something else. So the governor shut the city down. Okay, click again. We set it up in 4 grids. Our 2 state police took 1 grid. Boston police took 1 grid. We had our 2 regional partners, like our regional SWAT teams, like I'm sure you have here, Metrolec and Nemlec. Nemlec being the North Shore towns with their SWAT teams, and Metrolec being the closer metro region SWAT teams, and everybody took a grid. The thing with resources was, besides searching our grid with our EOD guys and our SWAT teams, then you have to reinforce the grid afterwards. So everywhere we searched, and these are things that, you know, I'm a detective. I find bad guys. The uniform, the patrol division, state police that do a lot of this stuff, once we did the search, we had to make sure that we weren't moving to another area and playing hopscotch with our suspect. The boat scene. One of the things that happened is the governor lifted the shelter in place before we were ready. And John Davin, who was a captain in Boston SWAT, was running the Tactical Operations Center in Watertown. And he reached out to Bill Evans and said, you know, Superintendent, I want 15 more minutes on our grid. We're almost done. They lifted the shelter in place. Most of the agencies started to leave. We stayed in place to finish our grid search. I was probably from here to the parking lot from 67 Franklin Street, along with Bill Evans and Paul O'Connor, and we were still in our grid. Before the call even went to the Watertown talk, a neighbor come out and said to us, hey, you know, my neighbor is calling Watertown police now. There's blood all over the back of his boat. We were able to run to the boat. That's how close we were, which the beauty that I saw in it was that we set up this grid in the middle of the night, you know, 1 o'clock in the morning in the pitch dark, with a couple of dozen officers, and we kept him inside our grid. Went up to the boat, there's blood on the back of the boat. He tried to poke through the heavy winter wrap. We could see he finally gets his finger through. He's doing the same thing we're trying to do. He's trying to get eyes and ears on us. We called for TAC teams, we called for EOD, we covered the boat. One of the things you'll see in the lessons learned will be the self-deployment stuff. You heard all the shots at the boat. I'll explain how that went down. Pay attention. One more time. So that's Paul O'Connor down in the corner. He was with us. Fortunately, before the shots rang out, we were, I want to say 360, but four sides, 1, 2, 3, and 4, all covered with police officers pointed at the boat. We know what's going to happen there. And not only that, but we got on the air and said, we have enough resources here, we just want TAC teams and EOD. And we get cops lined up on 4 sides of this yard, all pointing guns at each other. So, and you know, everybody wanted to help, and that's exactly why we're there. We quickly changed it to an L form, where we were behind the boat and on one side. Just back up one, Jimmy. Just on that Twitter, we had 53,000 followers in Boston. Again, not my thing. We went up to 304,000 during this 5 days of the marathon. Tremendous way for us to communicate with the public. You saw one of the tweets that went out. We asked people not to give out the locations of the responding units. What was happening is when we were going to houses, sometimes someone would say, well, that basement door is not supposed to be open. The citizens were putting out tweets saying, you know, officers searching the basement of, you know, 34 Main Street right now, and they started putting out the locations of our officers. Well, we were still looking for, we knew at least one. We didn't know if there was anyone else involved or who else they were with. So it made a big difference. We were able to put out tweets and hit the public, and everybody was following it right away. Keep going, Jimmy. I mean, obviously, any of these events now is where they want to be. You can look at that crowd. You can look at what happened, you know, recently in France with the trucks running people over, and the airport in Fort Lauderdale, the airport in Brussels. You know, we talk about the safety of the airports, but where do we always stand waiting? You're waiting in line to check in. You're waiting in line to pick up your luggage. So if we're paying attention to that, so aren't the bad guys. There's no way to protect every single thing. Protecting our soft targets, we knew we needed more equipment, more cameras, but also our businesses. Your biggest asset is all of our private businesses. Boylston Street had hundreds and hundreds of stores, high-end stores. They had video stuff, but some of those people were seeing us for the first time. You know, we weren't getting robberies at Saks Fifth Ave, but they had some tremendous video down there. So we made sure that all of our district detectives were going out and meeting with all the businesses in the meantime, after this tragedy, and making sure that it was, just like law enforcement, wasn't the first time we saw them. Click. You heard a lot of criticism about the exchange of information, that maybe the Bureau had information from Russia. Sanayev had made a couple of trips over to Chechnya. We made sure that those things weren't happening anymore. And think, you know, I'm a Boston police commander. I'm not really worried about what intelligence is coming out of Chechnya. And for the first time, we realized that, you know, the world is a lot smaller and it was changing. So for our intelligence unit, for our assets that are working with Homeland Security, FBI, Secret Service, and other places, that information had to continue to change. And understanding how it changed our city. I just went to a presentation 2 days ago down at Safeco, put on by the Department of Homeland Security, and this was one of the things they were talking about. This isn't bomb people learning how to identify IEDs. The bomb people know how to do it. We sent all of our narcotics guys, all of our gang guys, who are no longer going to be the public order platoon. They were going to be in plain clothes, mixed in the crowds, and all these things, so that they could identify suspicious activity and IED recognition. They, in turn, came back, especially the supervisors from narcotics and gangs. They came back and trained every uniformed officer in the police department over a period of weeks in what they learned down in Mexico. And Homeland Security, New Mexico, Homeland Security gave us videos and all of the training materials so that we could train the trainers. When I was just at Safeco 2 or 3 days ago, they were talking about that with a lot of the agencies, some that are represented here. We did it in 2014. Again, not because we were trying to get ahead of the curve, because we were already behind the curve. These tabletop exercises, again, as a detective for many years, detective sergeant, detective commander, I used to think that those tabletop exercises were for the guys from patrol, the guys from SWAT, the guys from bombs. We'll come in after you guys do all your playing, and well, every commander had to go to these tabletop exercises. And when I went to a couple of these prior, it would be, you know, well, there's an explosion, and now there's an active shooter, and we have a bus turned over, and I'm sitting there rolling my eyes like cops tend to do from time to time, every few minutes. And I'm like, this is never going to happen. We're never going to get all these things at once. Just to give you an idea, when Tamerlan Tsarnaev was brought to the Brigham and Women's Hospital, came in with police officers, ambulance, fire, etc., get him into the hospital. Naturally, we originally wanted to take them both alive. Someone said, one of the nurses said to one of the, what's going on? Oh, they got that shooter. He said, there's an active shooter in the emergency room. She hid herself in a linen closet, called her father, and said, there's an active shooter here at the hospital. The father called the police, called the news stations. So while we were running to the active shooting scene, and that's going to happen, because in times like this, people panic. While we're still responding to the shooting scene, we got an active manhunt going on for Zokar. Call comes out over our radio, Boston Police Radio, active shooter at Brigham and Women's Hospital. So again, when we're talking resources and where people are going, especially for the commanders in the room, it was a nightmare. And you know, things seemed to play out well. There was a lot of mistakes made. 2014 marathon, we got Tsarnaev on a Friday night. Monday morning, we started planning for the next year's marathon. There was also a ton of events. Vice President Biden came to town, but we started a week before. We had state police, Boston police, Newton police, Brookline police, all the towns that it went through were along the route. Just visibly out there, we had our suspicious activity reporting going. We contacted any apartment buildings, businesses along the route. You know, has anyone tried to rent a short-term rental, 3 months, 6 months, something facing the marathon route, making contacts all year long with all the businesses and anything that faced the marathon. Multiple command posts. One of the things that we found out when the bombs went off and we shut down the scene, some of our resources were on one side, especially with the fire. Fire was on, you know, used to set up mobile units on either side of the marathon so they could respond, but when this happened, it was impossible for everybody to get around. So placing our resources, police, fire, ambulances, multiple command posts along the route. Tactical Operations Center, and then a separate law enforcement command. We had our intelligence unit, which had representatives from every agency, police, state, local, federal, fire, ambulance, transportation, traffic, everybody's in the room. And then you have a unified command center with all of the bosses. So sometimes when you're making these investigative decisions, it's very difficult to have mayors, governors, senators, and others in the room who mean, you know, the best of intentions, but they don't do our job. So, entire route was lined with barriers, 36 entry points, and I know it would be a little bit difficult to do it in Seattle, but we had the entry points set up. If individuals try to get into these entry points and just decided, I'm going to turn around and walk, we had plainclothes officers from our narcotics gangs, major crimes, that were all spread out making observations. And if someone decided they didn't want to go through the checkpoint, we would make a stop of them, identify them, see what they had. In most of those occasions, it was people under the age of 21 who were trying to get in there with alcohol. So but it was just, it worked out well. When you work these events and you see some guy that just ran 26 miles at a little over 5 minutes a mile, some of them under 5 minutes a mile, it's natural for our police officers to like watch this finish and say, oh my God, it's amazing. We had 25% of our resources in the crowds and 75% of our resources lining the street. The following year we switched it. 75% of our resources were in the crowd. More than half of those were in plain clothes and 25% on the course. Before we were worried about, some type of international incident, someone tackling one of the elite runners or causing some type of an injury there, and we quickly switched it to, you have to just concentrate on the crowd and every single person in it. The command structure, when we broke down our, the only persons that had the entire plan were the police commissioner and the 5 superintendents. Intel, investigations, everyone else got, just before the marathon, everyone else got only the portion of the operational plan that related to them. And that was because we heard and we found out later on that some of our IEPs or operational plans were out there and that they were aware of them. So we divided it up into sections, and you only got the section you were responsible for, with the exception of the 5 superintendents. Staging areas, we had multiple staging areas, tactical plans set up. We had every federal agency from JHAT and all our assessment teams, SWAT teams spread out in different areas, low profile, a little more low profile and out of sight, but readily available at any time. And we did things like sand trucks at major entry points, etc., that normally you'd only have for a presidential visit. And I know they just did that recently, like in New York City at New Year's Eve, first night celebrations and the like. We did have our stress unit and our New York NYPD sent down their crisis intervention debriefing team, because there was a lot of police officers that were involved in this the year before, and we wanted to make sure that we were taking care of our guys. But when you look at resources, I talked about 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Most people doing 14, 16 hours at a time. That all sounded great. We thought we had a good plan. This was a 5-day event. We didn't plan on how we were feeding our cops, how, bathrooms, reliefs, medical emergencies. So we needed to make sure that we had enough resources out there. The city bought a couple of their own food trucks. Both unions, our patrolmen's union and our superior officers union, bought food trucks. Actually, and they sent them. They were down in New York recently for the funerals of the New York police officers that were murdered, and the donations came from like Legal Seafood, donated like 10,000 cups of chowder and things like that. So we were able to make sure that we took care of our cops as well. Get that, Jim? I talked about the business community. They had to know what to expect. My shop, the Bureau of Investigative Services, I had all my detectives out working with the businesses all year, and then I set up a separate investigative command post. Because when we talk about these tabletops, I think police response, uniform response, and SWAT and bombs always plan these things. And where the mix-up always comes, you can go all the way back to OJ or any of these other things, is the transference of the scene from uniform to investigations. So investigations became a big part. We set up our own area, and the things with the seasoned video, interviewing people, etc. We had all the teams set in place. And we never had an investigative command post set up separately, but it was something that we learned pretty quick. Special operations unit from every federal, state, and local partners were brought in, and then obviously we worked with all of our federal FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, Emergency Management, the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management, because we realized all the different logistical things that came up in that 5 days. Guy that came in, the guy that was a SAC of the FBI at the time was a guy by the name of Rick Delorius. Shortly after the bombing, he was he retired, and a guy by the name of Vincent Lisi became the FBI SAC. Vincent Lisi was a guy that worked gangs, drugs, and murders in Washington, and then when the anthrax attacks came, he took over that investigation. He ran anthrax for 7 years, and finally solved that case, and they offered him to be the SAC anywhere that he wanted to pick in the FBI. He chose Yemen. So he did 2 years in Yemen and Djibouti. It tells you what kind of a police officer he was, what kind of a law enforcement officer he was, and we were fortunate that the following year he was the SAC of the FBI. Tremendous relationship he had with us. Bicycle offices, emergency management, part of it was getting from place to place. 18 blocks, we're not driving around in police cars, so we got those little gators, which before we always made fun of the cop that was riding around with the gators with water on the back and food. This year we had 25 gators, and that continues on. And you always see the guy with the gator, you're like, I wouldn't get one of those. Well, now all of a sudden everybody was riding them. And then the Department of Public Works, I talked about sand trucks, major access routes, the same as we did for presidential visits. Boston Athletic Association runs the marathon. They're in charge of the marathon. They're a tremendous, it's 121 years now running, and they kind of always laid down the ground rules for the marathon. And Bill Evans became the police commissioner, and we let the Boston Marathon. They said, here's what we're going to do. We said, no. What you're going to do is sit down, have a seat. We're going to tell you what you're going to do. So the commanders from the state police, the various police agencies, we decided what the runners were going to do, what the runners could bring with them, clear bags, much like when you go into Seahawks and watch, you have to have clear bags, where the bags were, nobody was leaving backpacks by the finish line, and all of our officers, including our undercovers, and the narcotics guys would just have their balaclava on, covering their face, but they had to have some type of an ID attached to them, or at least secured in a manner that they could identify themselves quickly. We met with the businesses, social media was utilized constantly, and then we brought the media in, because the media is your biggest ally in getting your information out along with social media. The media outlets, same thing. They used to set up their shop, and most police don't bother with the media. We had police checking all media credentials, anything they were carrying in, trucks, etc. No one on the radio, and this was one of the biggest things, and for every police officer that's worked a big event or a parade, where's the end of the parade? Where's the start of the parade? Someone know where the reviewing stand is. All of those things that, we've all done hundreds of times. It was everything off the radio until such time that you had something that was necessary to be done. And then the BAA, the Boston Athletic Association, set up their own command center. Every supervisor in the city was required to come to a separate briefing, and then we did the entire briefing. We used, we had the resources in Boston University, right there along the parade route, their auditorium. So every sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and boss in the city. And then wireless priority, this is something, I'm not a tech guy, but the phones went out, our radios, some of them weren't working, and you can imagine when those bombs went off, every single person there on scene trying to pick up their phone and get on the phone. And we weren't even able to talk with each other. And I was asking earlier one of the sheriffs from Mason County, I said, when you have incidents like we just had with the double homicide, are you guys able to talk to each other? Well, you think the big city in Boston, Mass State Police is different. We were no different. None of us could talk to each other, which is kind of what happened at some of those self-deployment scenes. We put the arm on all of our businesses. We were able to get better wireless communication. We were able to get new equipment. We tested all of our video and camera systems during our St. Patrick's Day parade, and just really increased technology, all of the things that can go wrong in this. You can jump ahead, Jim. those are the 4 people that were killed during this. You know, Martin Richard, 8 years old. Crystal Campbell, she was at the Red Sox game. That picture you've seen of her standing at Fenway Park. Fenway Park's about 1/8 of a mile from the marathon finish line. And every Patriots Day, there's a Red Sox game. It's really good when it's Red Sox Yankees, because instead of 40,000 people, there's about 60,000 people show up. The stadium empties, it's 11 o'clock start, it's the only 11 o'clock start of the year. Stadium's usually empty at about 3 o'clock, 3:30. So whether or not the Sanias planned it that way, but you have the largest crowd finishing the marathon, you have the largest crowd led into the finish line area, and then you have an additional 35,000 people, 35 to 40,000 people leaving Fenway, coming down saying, hey, let's catch a little bit of the marathon. That's where she was. Lindsay Lou was a graduate student at Boston University, right up the street, first Boston Marathon. And then obviously I talked about Sean Collier, just a tragedy in and of itself. I know that was kind of lengthy. I think you got the idea of it. I probably jumped through some stuff, but I'll be willing to take any questions if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, Bobby, did you know by interviewing the suspect that survived if they had planned on any other terroristic activities following Boston?
So they planned to, here's the thing that we were able to find out. So the 4th of July in Boston is a huge event. It's along the Charles River, both sides of the Boston-Cambridge side of the Charles River. It's, you know, in excess of 100,000 people in one area. Had they carried out their original plan, which they planned on setting up 3 separate pressure cookers down there at the Esplanade, we never would have had, we would have had dozens more casualties. There was just no, you know, you can't get the medical personnel in there, you can't get the fire in there, you can't get any of that. And then their plan was, when they were gassing up in Brighton, was to take those IEDs and the pressure cooker, set the pressure cooker off in Times Square, and then start setting off the IEDs as people were running from the explosion. Sir?
The one that traveled to Chechnya, did he have, how much training did he get there, or if he got any at all?
So that was one of the bones of contention, but he was training with a terrorist group in Chechnya. He was in the FBI's database. They had interviewed him some months prior, and he was cleared. He was in their E-Guardian program. He was picked up. But also, we know that about 3 months prior to the marathon, Tamerlan Tsarnaev and 2 other individuals, one by the name of Todashev, were involved in a homicide. They were, obviously, they were Muslim. They murdered 2 Jewish kids who were selling marijuana, dozens of pounds of marijuana. They murdered them and then dumped the marijuana all over their bodies and their money. So it wasn't a robbery, it was more of a hate crime. Todashev was the fellow that the Mass State Police and the FBI were interviewing down in Florida when he jumped up with a knife and he was shot by a federal agent and killed.
Several people I talked to today, knowing you were coming, went and actually watched the movie. I saw it a couple of weeks ago. Could you talk a little bit about the accuracy of the movie and how it played out as part of that?
Yeah, so if you look at the actual video that I showed here from the day of the thing, I think Peter Berg was the director of the movie and Wahlberg was the main character. So Danny Keeler was the sergeant that you hear on the scene saying, stop the marathon, get me every piece of medical equipment up here, get all cruisers, keep the streets open. Danny ran the initial bombing scene, did a phenomenal job, and then I came on the scene in a couple of minutes, having run dozens of homicide scenes, the worst I've ever seen, nothing that I had ever experienced. But after a couple of minutes standing there with some of my homicide investigators, he's like, Bobby, it's a crime scene. We just gotta, and we did all the things that we do and you do at every crime scene. We start shutting down the scenes. They did a phenomenal job there, and they squeezed in 5 days, 5.5 days into 2 hours and 10 minutes. They did a great job with the investigation, what the Tsarnaevs were like. They hated our country, they hated our ways, They hated everything about us. However, they were in Section 8 housing. They were on, Zokar was on a full scholarship for being a refugee from a foreign nation, a full scholarship at University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, which is about, you know, somewhere between $25,000 and $40,000 a year. Food assistance, all of those things that we do in this country for our folks that are less fortunate than some, and yet this is why they hated us. It didn't make sense. Zokar was supposedly, you know, a devout Muslim, following all of the teachings. However, he's down at UMass. He was selling weed. He was smoking weed. He was hanging out with American women. I mean, all of the things that aren't part of his religion. So there was a lot of contrast in between. They did a great job of that. The interview scene where the agent from the Bureau come in, that's pretty accurate. The one thing that they really kind of blew up, if you will, and not a pun, was the Watertown shootout scene. There was over 200 and some odd rounds fired there. There was a pressure cooker set off, and there was 2 IEDs exploded during the shootout in Watertown, 3 unexploded, 1 that was exploded during the police chase. They threw one out of the car during the chase. But in the movie, they blow up some police cars and stuff like that. A little bit of Hollywood there, but really the actual scene would have sufficed. But other than that, pretty good. Wahlberg takes on a composite role, switches from Dan Keeler to my role. But again, you know, I was one of many, many, many cops that, you know, sometimes wrong place, wrong time, right place, right time, whatever you want to call it. Or as my son was on the police department about 19 months at the time, and someone used to always say to him, excuse me, if it offends anybody, he's like, if there's shit around, your father's going to step in it or kick it. And and that's just how it was. I mean, we had people leaving the scene, people on scene, and, you know, we were no further than the parking lot from the boat. So, but the same thing with the cooperation there, talking about the partners. The FBI hostage rescue team showed up along with our SWAT team and the Mass State Police SWAT team, and we're like, great, here's the pros, here you go. And Derek Bailey was the leader of the HRT team. He goes, oh no, commanders. He goes, all 3 of us are going to be making all these decisions here. And Ned will tell you that when we were down in Quantico for the 4 months of the FBI Academy, all that HRT team does all day and night long is jump out of helicopters, and I know you were down there, and shoot guns. And that's exactly what they did. You probably remember from looking at the scene, they flew our SWAT team down in Black Hawk helicopters down to UMass Dartmouth when we hit the school down there looking for Zokar. And every decision that was made with the HRT team was Bill Evans, myself, along with Derek Bailey from HRT. And whether we were doing flashbangs, whether we were doing gas, whether we were doing noise, negotiations, etc. No one charged the boat. We talked them out of the boat. I did the negotiation at the boat scene, you know, and I shouldn't even say I did negotiation. He never spoke. I just kept talking. As you can probably tell, I can do that. And eventually, we convinced him after, you know, hours of all of the drama there at the boat to get up on the side of the boat, lift his shirt, raise his hands. He went down, and then the ATF, medical people, FBI, and our SWAT team took him into custody. Talk about self-deployment. I remember just earlier probably an hour or so before we got to the boat scene, I see a young man walk by, green uniform, right out of Cops R Us, you know, 6'2", blonde hair, muscles coming from everywhere, a machine gun over his shoulder, straps of bullets like Pancho Villa, and I said, Clinton, Mass. I said, I've been in Massachusetts, born and raised in Boston my entire life. I said, where is that? He said, oh, we're way in the western part of the state. I said, oh. I said, how many police officers do you have? He said, sir, we have 6 full-time. I said, okay. I said, who are you here with? He said, oh, I got up this morning, I was on a day off. He said, I saw you folks needed help down here. He said, so I came along. Who's in charge of them? And there was a lot of that. You know, Boston Police had commanders on every scene, State Police had commanders, the Bureau had commanders, Watertown Police had commanders, but we had a lot of agencies that showed up there that had no bosses, and technically, we didn't even know who was there. So you can see how that happened. The shootout at the boat, and it said, you know, after exchange of gunfire, Sanayev had no gun left, and he had no bombs left in the boat. So if we were lucky, we would have just, or if we were, you know, hadn't been doing it a certain way all day long, we would have pulled him out of the boat, and that would have been over in about 5 minutes. We put an officer in the second deck of the house to look down on the boat. We had seen Sanayev literally get his finger through the tarp. That's how close we were. He starts to poke his finger through to try to tear that hole. Officer in the second deck yelled gun, fired into the boat, and you know what happened next. 103 rounds into the boat. Thank God, all from one side. So we had no one behind the boat. Fortunately for Sanayev, when you saw the video, it was an inboard motor. He was lying on the left side of the boat as you were facing it. He didn't know where we had our people deployed. He was behind the engine block, and everybody fired from the right side, which is why he didn't get killed. He lost a piece of a digit during that shooting, but most of his injuries were from the shootout and the crash the night before. So the one line they did steal from me in the movie that they assigned to Bill Evans was, I had worked gangs, drugs, homicides for a long time. I had been around a lot of shooting and whatnot. And Bill Evans, I always used to make fun of him, tremendous boss. He worked the other side of the tracks by Fenway Park, Faneuil Hall, downtown, as we called it, the Bright Lights District. So when all the shots rang out, I looked at him. He was as white as the tablecloth. He looked at me, I looked at him, and I said, that thing ain't gonna float again, Billy. They gave him that in the movie, and I can tell you, it was a long, long week, and, you know, as cop humor has it, you know, 15 minutes before we found the guy in the boat, we were searching yard to yard. We had been out for about 60 hours, and Paul O'Connor, the other lieutenant with us, he sat down on the steps, put his head up against the railing, and he dozed off. So what did we do? We left him there. We walked away. We got about a block and a half up the street when he woke up, and he came out. You know. And, I mean, it was a long week for us, but it worked out well. Any other questions, sir?
Having been in law enforcement and now in the emergency response community, and knowing the propensity for these terrorist groups and terrorists to plan secondary explosions to take out emergency responders, is there any kind of training that you could recommend that, you know, that us as incoming emergency responders could get or give to our people, you know, to kind of ameliorate that situation so that we don't walk into a situation where another explosion is going to take all of us out?
So one of the things that we did, and there was some consternation at first, is we dispatched all of our detectives, and again in Boston that's a couple of hundred that weren't working the scene, to all the hospitals. And I talked about, you know, some of the things that play out well. So we had 5 major trauma hospitals within 1.5 miles of the bombing scene. 8 Trauma 1 hospitals within 3 miles of the bombing scene. So, you know, living in a city like Boston or Seattle, if something happened downtown, it would be fine. But we started to train all of our hospital personnel the exact same way. We did the active shooter type training, suspicious activity reporting, and within a year of this, we had an active shooter at a hospital. As it turned out, it was an individual that shot his mother's doctor because he felt she didn't get the prior care before she became deceased. But it was an active shooter at the hospital, and the training worked out great because when our SWAT teams went in, clearing the hospital just to make sure we didn't have someone else in there, all of the people were they did the 3 things that they were taught, which was to run, hide, and then ultimately fight. And we put all of our hospitals, we've done that training at the institutions, but our EMS, our ambulances, fire, they train with us in all of these active shooter situations. And with fire, it's, you know, hot zones, warm zones, things like that, because many times, if you have one of these situations, there's gonna be fires to fight, there's gonna be explosions to tend to, but you also might have an active shooter. So there's no bad training, but I know we've talked at Waspic and other places, it's important for this active shooter training, start with police, but then branch out to your emergency medical and your fire. Colleges, we trained, again, Boston, dozens of colleges right in the downtown area, and we just saw in Ohio State that they we had an attack there. There's no limit to people that should be trained, including the business community.
You know, in Thurston County, we've started the active shooter training between law enforcement and EMS response, and that's working out pretty well. And in fact, after the last training, about a month later, we had an active shooter in one of our local high schools. But I was thinking more along the lines of bombs and IEDs and explosive devices and things like that, because that's something that you can't point to a person and say he's the active shooter.
So same thing, we send folks down to that, and Homeland Security pays for that, by the way. We send dozens down because of the size of our department, but in most of your departments, sheriff department, etc., you could send 1 or 2 officers down. They do a train the trainer, they give you the resources, and you can come back and it's for IED detection, all the different types, whether it's a vehicle-borne IED, whether it's a personal, wearing the vest, whether it's, and then they talk all about the blast zones as well, like how far you should get away for each thing, and things that you should get behind, and so on. It's training that I got it as from one of my guys that came back. I sat in on the training. I think that we did it for police, but it could clearly go to fire, EMS, and all the other emergency response people.
Okay, thanks, that's good information.
And it's Homeland Security does it, and they pay for the training. So, anything else?
From when you interviewed the suspect that survived, did he give you an indication from the time of planning to the time of execution, how long, how many days that was, how many months that was?
He didn't. He really didn't do much talking, although he ended up, we all got prepared for court. I had a couple of 100 pages of court documents to testify to all along the way, and basically none of that became necessary, only for the sentencing phase, because they fessed up to everything with the exception of, trying to put him to death. He was sentenced to death. He's still awaiting the death penalty in federal. We don't have the death penalty in Massachusetts, but we do under the Federal Guidelines Terrorist Act, so that's how he was sentenced to death. But my 35 years in this business tells me that I will be dead long before Zolkar Sanayev is. But not a whole lot about why, and all of it, and part of that training with the IEDs and Homeland Security is all of this Aspire magazine. I don't recommend you go on, but if you do go on from a police website so that you don't have, the FBI, the ATF knocking on your door. But all of this, their pipe bombs, their elbow pipe bombs, their pressure cookers with a timer from a remote for a little remote control car, all of that came from the instructions in Aspire magazine. And if you look at some of the latest editions of Aspire magazine, it's exactly what's gone on in France and at Ohio State and other places. Use a vehicle, use a truck, take out as many innocent people as you can. Sir?
If there's one thing all the law enforcement personnel here, you want them to take away, if they only take away one thing from what you've said here today, what would that be?
The biggest thing is, and it's kind of a word that gets overused in this business, is partnerships. But everyone says, oh well, we have a partnership with the clergy, we have a partnership with the business. You have to have relationships. So I mean, all of you folks in the room have known each other, worked with each other, assisted each other. Those aren't partnerships, those are relationships. And the fact that we had relationships, especially with our federal agencies that were working in the area, from the FBI, ATF, DEA, right across the board, you have to have those relationships, or it's, when it hits the fan, it's not going to work. Thank you.